So in this lesson, we're going to talk a little bit about barrel aging. We're going to talk about the wonders of barrel aging, and we're going to talk about a few misconceptions and things that are just useful to know when thinking about using an aged versus unaged spirit. So what's interesting is right here in front of me, I have 2 bottles of whiskey from a Missouri distiller called Woodhat, and this is their blue corn whiskey unaged, and this is it aged. So what's fun about having 2 things like this on hand is to taste the difference between the 2, because all spirits come out of the still white. So when you are distilling anything, whether that is a rum, a tequila, a whiskey, etc., they come out of the still looking like this. When we see coloring on this, that's from one of 2 things. It's color picked up from barrel aging, or there are many spirits out there that are actually artificially colored. But what's important to first get out of the way is that barrel-aged spirits are not better than unaged spirits. They're merely different. Older spirits are not better than younger spirits. They're merely different. The longer that something sits in a barrel, whether it's an oak barrel, a French limousine cask, all sorts of things, the longer it sits in a wooden cask, the more it's going to pick up the flavors of that wood. And in many cases, while it's not the case with American bourbon, which has to be used in new oak casks all the time, in many cases, we're using wine barrels, beer barrels, something that we're sitting our Scotch whiskey in a barrel that rum has been made in. The longer that it sits in that barrel, the more that it not only adopts this color, but the more that it picks up the notes from the wood and anything that might be steeped in the wood. The reason why barrel-aged spirits can be more expensive, one, there is a perceived increase in value, but the reality is it also can be much more expensive for the distiller to make, because they are going through the same process, we're getting to this guy, but then this distillery right here, they had to buy barrels. They had to sit this in the barrels. They had to have a place to store the barrels. And the reality is there's a term out there called angel's share. And the angel's share is the percentage of the spirit that every year evaporates or is soaked into the wood cask and cannot be then bottled. And depending on how long it's aged and the climate it's aged in can depend on how dramatic that angel's share is. So ultimately that means the distiller is losing some of their product. And so this is where one of the things that's interesting is añejo tequila, for example, is often, when it's aged, is often aged in oak barrels. And the longer that añejo tequila sits in oak barrels, the more it will end up tasting like many whiskeys that are sat in similar style oak barrels. This is where I often say, and I even remember my friend Stefan saying, he's like, hey, I used to be really into whiskey, and while I still am, I'm really into añejo tequila now because they're actually fairly similar. So if you're into bourbons being so hot, looking at aged rums, looking at aged tequilas, these are fantastic things. And with that in mind, while it's not super common, you can put gins in a barrel. You can put vodkas in a barrel. And the longer they sit in that barrel, the more of those woody qualities they will take on. With these 2, it's also important to know that since this has been aged, if I was going to make cocktails with each of these, I would actually use different recipes. Here I would use more of a whiskey sour template. Here I would use more of what would be a gin gimlet style recipe. I would tend to probably more likely pair this with lime than with lemon like I would over here. Over here I'm making a Manhattan. Over here I'm going to make a little bit more closer to a martini style cocktail. One of the other things that's interesting, especially, and you hear this conversation a lot in the agave family, is that mezcal in particular is very, very intensive to produce. All agave plants on average grow from 8 to 30 years. So whereas bourbon can be used this year's corn harvest, we have to wait 8, 10, 12 years or more to have an agave harvest. And there's a resistance at times against aging mezcal in part because the longer something sits in a barrel, the less it actually tastes like itself. And if we're using, in many of these people's perceptions, great quality agave plants, great sugarcane plants, great grapes for making brandy, there is a case to be made for actually sipping it unaged, because it's going to taste more like it would, you're going to taste more of the fruit or of the plant that originally the distillate comes from. So this is where I always like to share that many of the things I like to sip the most are often unaged spirits. Unaged rum agricole, unaged mezcal are just fantastic. It blows people's minds to think like, oh, that like drinking white whiskey like is somehow like still has a moonshiny element to it. But when it's good quality white whiskey that essentially ultimately went on to become this, you're going to taste more. What did that corn and other grains taste like? So the lesson of the story here is not that barrel-aged things are bad or I'm casting dispersions on it, but that giving clear spirits a chance and tasting them on their own, knowing that these can be sippable, delicious things, are wonderful. And so that's a little lesson for you on barrel aging, and we will see you in the next lesson.